Welcome everybody to the fourth session. Fourth session of You Can Sit With Us. And for those who are new here, I'll just do a really brief intro before we hand over to Dunya. But these sessions started as, I would say, kind of a reaction of all the political climate we're in currently, and feeling the need for not just young people, just people all around, to kind of equip them with tools on everyday topics that affect our everyday lives through people who actually know what they're talking about. So we're speaking to people who have jobs or are very active within the industries of health and policy and politics, education, just loads of activists as well. And I think it's just to give you a little bit of basic insight on discussions we hear a lot about and we get a lot of information about, and on the internet is really easy to be persuaded into forming an opinion because someone you look up to has a certain opinion, but how do you know what they're talking about and where did they get their information from? So what we're trying to do through these sessions is to give you a bit of information from an expert, and from there, leave you with a little bit of homework and hopefully, inspire you to then do your homework and research yourself if you find it interesting enough, or if you feel like, hey, actually, I'm not scared of this topic. I'm not scared of this conversation, and I shouldn't be because it affects my everyday life. So that's a little bit of in a nutshell, what we do here with You Can Sit With Us. All the sessions are always live Mondays, 8 p.m. here on Zoom, and then the next day they will air on Rinse. So if you find it interesting, do tell your friends to tune in tomorrow, 4 to 5 p.m. And then the video goes on YouTube the week after. Today's session, Asylum, Immigration, and Unlawful Detention, mouthful, with our expert Dunya Kamal, who is a trainee solicitor. And this happened through Instagram and the posts I was doing. And when I got an email from Dunya, not only is her current role and the cases that she works on extremely interesting, but also very relevant right now. It always has been, but I think for our generation is becoming more relevant now, specifically what we've heard with Windrush and just a lot of articles, even with ICE in the States, we're hearing a lot more about it. We're becoming a lot more aware of what's happening, and it happens through our government. And then I actually got a little bit of a backstory of what she did before she was a trainee solicitor, and that has been very interesting as well. So I'm going to mute myself. Every now and then I will unmute myself because of a question that I genuinely have, or maybe, Dunya will use an abbreviation that to her has become everyday lingo, but maybe for us isn't. Please feel free to use the chat. I'll be monitoring that as well. And then hopefully we have a really good hour. Take it away.
Thank you so much for that. It's a lovely introduction. Also, just a caveat, I'm not an expert on everything that I'm going to be talking about today. I think it's worth just saying that very clearly at the start. But yes, I am a trainee solicitor and I am in the public law team at Duncan Lewis. So I think it's probably worth taking some time to talk about what public law actually is. In essence, it's taking the government to court. So it's challenging the legality of a government decision. So say, for example, we have a client that's been detained in a detention centre and his mental health is in a really bad way. He's a victim of torture from his home country, and actually being detained is making his mental health worse. It's actually negatively impacting on his mental health. Then we would say, this person is being unlawfully detained because on the balance within the rules, the immigration rules and how the guidance dictates, this person, his immigration status can be monitored in the community outside of detention. So where it's negatively impacting his health, that should amount to unlawful detention. And what we usually do, and there are a set of rules that we have to follow, and we essentially send a sternly worded letter to the Home Office, making it clear in a legal argument why we think this person has been unlawfully detained. And we have to give the Home Office a certain amount of time to respond. And as you can imagine, we often don't get a satisfactory response from them. So they usually either don't reply at all, or they say, the Home Office believes that this person is being detained. There's nothing wrong with what we've done, and we're going to keep detaining him. Everything you've said doesn't amount to unlawful detention. We just reject everything that you've claimed. So at that point, there's really nothing else that we can do. We've tried to resolve it outside of the court. And then what we would do is what's called issue judicial review proceedings. And that's basically asking for the court's permission to review the decision of the Home Office. So it's taking it to the court and out of kind of our hands directly. And that's really taking the government to court. So we do that on a daily basis. And I think it's probably worth mentioning that everything that we do within that is under legal aid. So that means that you're not looking at a private client where they come to you and say, I've got this problem and I want this objective, I've got this objective, I want to resolve it in this way. Here's X amount of money and then go and do it. We actually, no client of ours ever pays us any money, and it's all under the legal aid agency. So that's kind of, I think, quite an important point to make. And there are certain confines within that. So it can be restrictive in certain ways. We have to apply for funding, for example, before we take that challenge to court. We need the legal aid agency to say, okay, yeah, we agree, we're giving you funding of this amount. And again, as you can imagine, typically, especially now with what's come under legal aid has reduced in scope. So less issues, less things under asylum and immigration are now under the legal aid scope. So it's harder, it's getting even harder to represent clients on these issues because the government has reduced the scope of these things. So we're working within that framework, but also, again, worth kind of remembering that these are clients that are the most marginalised, who are extremely vulnerable and often have been let down by previous solicitors. So it's really sad to hear sometimes they've actually been to private solicitors, they paid, they didn't realise that what they wanted to be done was actually could be done under legal aid, and that they were eligible because they weren't told. And then that solicitor has gone and not only done very little or bad work, but actually it's often also negatively impacted their case. And so we have to kind of deal with the after effects of that as well. So I think that's just generally, that's public law, that's immigration, that's the work that I do in a broad sense, and kind of the structure of the legal aid system that we do it in. But yeah, as has been mentioned, that I've not kind of gone into law straight away. Didn't wake up at one day, age 12, and think I'm going to be a lawyer and that's it for me for the rest of my life. I did kind of do a bit of NGO work before. So I was working at Amnesty for 3 years. In a bit of a comms role, so doing much more kind of global social media related stuff, which was amazing. And then before that, quite randomly, I was working at ASOS, and I had a fashion blog, which I started in my second year at uni. So again, a world away from law, and I do still love clothes, but just in a different way now. But yeah, so kind of doing that, and I found my future manager at Amnesty by networking at this conference while I was working at ASOS, and just kind of made a beeline for her and then DM'd her on Twitter. And
how did your, if I may ask, how did you figure out, what was it that drove you to start working at Amnesty before you got to the firm where you are now? Like, what was it in your personal experiences that you thought, I'm not just going to support by donating or by signing petitions and engaging in conversation, but actually dedicating my 9 to 5 to it?
Yeah, good question. I guess I've felt that there has been kind of, I probably wouldn't pinpoint one specific thing, but I think if I were to go back, there is one moment that I do actually think of, and I don't know if I associate that with wanting to work at Amnesty, but maybe it's more broadly just wanting to help people generally. And I remember quite clearly around the coalition invasion of Iraq, and my parents are Iraqi, so they came here in the 80s. My dad is a refugee, and they came here in the 80s. I was born here. But I remember seeing and kind of hearing and experiencing my mum contacting her sisters, my aunts and cousins, whenever we'd hear of an explosion in the capital in Baghdad, and kind of just being a bit anxious or a bit uncertain if we couldn't get through to them straight away. And obviously, I mean, I was about 11 years old at the time, but I remember feeling like there was something not right here, and there was something going on, and I didn't really fully understand it at the time, but seeing it from that personal level and kind of the anguish or the effect that had on my mum, I guess, in a way made me feel that I wanted to be part of what made things right, because whatever would happen to my aunts or cousins clearly was wrong, clearly wasn't right. And so I think that as like a really early memory of just, I guess, the word injustice, which sounds like such a cheesy kind of link to make, but that really is like a memory that I have, and I still think about that as like a push to wanting to help. So I guess that explains Amnesty, and also probably explains the kind of the work that I'm doing now within human rights law as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And what we've noticed with a lot of the conversations we had through all the sessions is that the people that we speak to have this strong sense of community and wanting to contribute to the just having seen what a lack of community can do to their own personal lives and their families, wanting to do different and to do better moving forward. And I know you and I were talking as well, it's not even for us, but it's for the next generation and people that are maybe a bit further removed from us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Continue. Thanks for sharing that, by the way.
That's okay. You're welcome. Yeah, so I guess going back to maybe the work and talking about the kind of the issues and things that I do on a daily basis, or I mean, it's really hard, I think, with this kind of work, not to make it sound sexy, but not that working till 1 a.m. is sexy, but there are some days where you do end up doing, you know, a 14, 16-hour shift just because, for example, a client has been made homeless, their home office accommodation has, for all of a sudden, you know, it's expired, even though they remained, they should have stayed in there and they were eligible for it to continue, but they are, you know, sitting on a bench in the middle of nowhere. They don't know what to do. They've got no one else to talk to. And then it's obviously down to you to try and secure them at least, you know, temporary overnight hotel accommodation, that kind of thing. So I mean, that doesn't happen every week, but there are occasions when that does happen.
Can I ask you something?
Sorry, yeah.
So sorry. When you mentioned the example of someone who's become homeless because of negligence from the home office and they don't have anybody to stay with or speak to, how do they end up finding people like yourself or the firm that you work for? How does that process usually go? Because I know you already said some of them will have had private firms or lawyers work on the case, but I just genuinely think if you already are someone who doesn't have anyone to lean on or to tell you where to find help, how does someone like that find you?
Yeah, good question. So in my experience, what's happened with, I've had a client that was a pre-existing client that this happened to, but also we get referrals a lot of the time from charities who work with really vulnerable people. They are often, you know, asylum seekers or those that have been refused asylum and who are in need of medical assistance or support. So a lot of the time we get those referrals, and we work really closely with, you know, those smaller charities, and we'll definitely kind of talk a bit more about that as well later on, just because I think it's worth taking a bit of time to actually reference them by name and talk about them and go through the work that they do in a way that hopefully for some people listening might actually lead to them checking them out afterwards. But yeah, so in terms of the work, I want to mention the charter flight in February, the one to Jamaica, because I think that was a really very clear example of quite aggressive conduct from the Home Office when it came to their repeated attempts to get the Court of Appeal to change their mind when it came to the decision to take a certain number of people off the flight that had been affected by the challenge that we had brought. And that was, you know, that went on until about 1:30 in the morning, 1 a.m. So that was quite a late one. But it's worth going into a bit of detail on that case, just because I think it's what really struck me at the time was the language that was used by the Home Office and the way that they portrayed these people as all serious criminals, and they're all serious foreign criminals, and they were a danger to our community. I think what is dangerous is if we get stuck in this kind of back and forth about who is more or less deserving of being in the UK. If we start doing that, I think we're on a slippery slope. And so I want to caveat what I'm about to say, because I I fall into the trap myself easily. It's very easy to do that, especially when you're talking about vulnerable clients. But generally, you know, everyone should have access to justice. Everyone should be able to, you know, have their case viewed before law and have that kind of opportunity to have their say. But one of the clients I represented actually came to the UK when he was 4 years old, and he's 22 now. And he, by Priti Patel's definition, would have amounted to a serious foreign criminal. He was convicted and sentenced to more than 4 years for a drugs offence. But there's so much within his circumstances that just by, you know, one chat with him on the Sunday when his flight was on Tuesday, it was clear that at least we had concerns that he had been a potential victim of trafficking for the purpose of county lines, so that he was recruited as a kid in his local area and kind of forced to stay in this gang and be taken to what county lines is basically being driven to usually other counties further out than London, and having to stay for upwards of 2-3 months at a time sometimes, just selling, and also having to stay there until the elder people in the community in the gangs would say that it's okay for you to come back. So that for me was really obvious, a case of just seeing that this person clearly had this vulnerability. He had also mental health issues. None of that, despite it being known to the Home Office, none of that made any difference in terms of the Home Office considering his case. So when they say that they, consider each case on a, individual basis, and they look at all the, whatever the evidence is, all of that, I mean, we consistently see time and time again that they fail to do it, and they don't. And I think often within our team, especially, we talk about Home Office incompetence and them being just unable to do this. But I think that's also maybe letting them off a bit easy. I think what we have seen, especially with the language around the charter flight to Jamaica, is that there is an intentional callousness to their policies and the way that they make these decisions, and also the language they use and how it is really not only institutionally racist, but also directly racist to the clients that we represent. So I think we need to kind of be aware of that, as well as just saying, it's incompetence. It's clearly not just 1 or 2 caseworkers in the department. It's much bigger than that. It's much broader than that. And you can see it even in Priti Patel's announcement today of the immigration laws, and how certain, again, I think porters and other care workers are excluded. And you've got, again, that talk of the low skill, the migrant worker, which has propped us up during this pandemic, and yet even now still they're excluded from this scheme. So I think it's just worth making that point on incompetence, but also it's intentional and it's cruel, and we see that every day with the treatment that our clients receive from the Home Office. So I think in terms of working week and how a day or week goes, it is a lot. It can be quite last minute. It can be quite urgent, and it definitely can also be very out of hours as well if we need to. And the charter flight is a definite good example of that, I think, because we just went to the very ends of, as like final call on that Monday night, just to get those people off the flight. And it's worth saying that client that we represented, we put in a letter on Sunday night, and he was off the flight the following day. So it goes to show it's not that his case has no merits or it's not arguable at all what he's been through. It's just that people in the Home Office aren't looking at these cases properly. They're not considering what's been put to them, and only until we put it to them, or we threaten legal action, or we actually take them to court, do things change. And that's, again, problematic, because the policies themselves should be helping these people from the outset, from the get-go, and they're not until we make them help those people, if that makes sense.
That's an amazing story. And also the urgency of it all. Like, there's literally a young man counting down the hours until being taken away from somewhere where he didn't even come to by his own choice at 4 years old. Question about that. I know we've spoken about this before. I can imagine with your type of work, there's so much reading and material that you have to go through, which is I mean, I can't even imagine how much that is. But then with the case that has so much urgency and real people involved, what does the out of office work look like?
Good question. What it can, I mean, really, it can look like, well, I'll give the example of the charter flight because we were in on a Sunday, pretty much all day Sunday. And I think is an exceptional example, and that doesn't happen every month by any means, but we were in the office until about 4 a.m. I think, and back in around 9 or 10 the following day. And it's really worth pointing out that the public law team that I'm in is huge, and there are amazing people that I work alongside, and so nothing is really ever just me doing it. So yeah, you're right, there is a lot of reading, there's a lot of law, but there is pretty much an expert in something for anything in the team. If I need to ask about, for example, a specialist on asylum in Afghanistan, I know someone I can speak to about that. If I need to talk about domestic violence or trafficking, there's an expert in the team for that. So it's worth saying that, yeah, absolutely, it's tough and the hours can be long when you're faced with that kind of challenge, but you're never really doing it alone. And that's kind of one of the nicest things I think about the team, and also just having that much passion for this work between us, because you're not really just sat there for 24 hours studying and doing that. Definitely no.
I keep forgetting I mute myself, so I'm like, yeah. You can't hear me. That's brilliant. I know you already know what you want to talk about, but I thought maybe I can ask you, as far as you're aware, what within your line of work, what do the stats look like? Or do you want to come to that later? Because
that's about
what type of people inhabit these roles and are in these firms?
Yeah, I guess it's hard to, I think more generally speaking, when it comes to public law and immigration, when we're talking about BAME, Black and minority ethnic people in that area, there is an underrepresentation. But within our firm, from speaking from this experience, we're a bit unusual in the sense that we overrepresent on people of color who work within the kind of legal aid and within our firm as well. I do think it's important though to mention that perhaps the umbrella term of BAME isn't necessarily that useful on this kind of thing, because while there are a lot of people of color in the firm, if you then differentiate that to Black people, there aren't that many, and there aren't enough. And I think that kind of thing, especially since George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of taking all this, really powerful change has happened, and there's been a lot of kind of reckoning within ourselves as well. I've been having conversations with my director about this, and I know others in the team have as well. And I think there's nothing wrong with the way that people are hired, because they're hired based on merits, how good their CV is. But I think when you're talking about an industry that notoriously doesn't pay as well as the corporate side, so thinking of all the suits people, where that's not us at all. So if you're coming from a lower income family, then you can't afford to apply for a job that doesn't pay very well, because you don't have the safety net, you don't have the family to fall back on. And typically the people that do tend to be more so white people than not. So I think looking at not the formula to hire people, but how do we get more Black people actually in a position where they feel that they can apply? Because I think the constraints of legal aid, the fact that we also don't have the resources because we're pretty much a legal aid firm, are also an issue. But I think addressing that and kind of finding a way to change that formula slightly so that we do open it up and make it more fair for people to apply from different backgrounds, where they're not then faced with, oh, this doesn't pay enough, so I'm not even going to bother applying, which I think is a really big problem, because I think we're losing out on a big pool of really smart, intelligent, amazingly passionate people that just don't bother applying because it's just simply not realistic for them to do that.
I think, yeah, you make a great point there. I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is something that came up in last week's session with race and health as well, that we see the imbalances, but very often there's reasons behind the imbalances that we don't seem to think of right away. We tend to think it's like, oh, you're maybe not hiring, or there's not enough doctors of color in this area or in this borough, but actually it goes way deeper than that, and the issue needs to be addressed further down the line before we can actually make an impact for it to trickle down on the forefront, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm glad you said that.
Thanks. I do think it's worth saying, though, I mean, while we're not Suits and there's no Harvey going around in our office, at least not more than self-proclaimed Harveys going around the office, you can eventually make a living or live comfortably in this type of job. Obviously, it takes longer and there is more graft to it, but it's not impossible. So I think it's just worth kind of saying that, because it's not just about corporate. If you're interested in something that's beyond that, then there is this option, and I think it's worth kind of making it clear that, I mean, I'm in the grafting stage in my junior role, but I'm very aware that this will pay off at some point, and I'm looking forward to it. So that's definitely the case.
And you can sleep well at night knowing that you're fighting the good fight as well. What did you study yourself? How did you end up being?
What did I study?
Yeah.
I studied international relations with Spanish, so I did a bit of that at Sussex, which was quite, it was really interesting and quite formative. I remember the second year class on gender and politics just blew my mind. I didn't really think about feminine. I mean, it sounds really strange to say, but I wasn't really aware of, theories and like feminism so much when I was that age. So that was international relations. So more of the kind of the more global stuff, but definitely relevant in parts to what I was doing a bit at Amnesty and also here as well.
Brilliant. Continue. I'm going to mute myself again.
So I was just going to talk about I guess if it makes sense then to kind of maybe do a bit on other charities that we also work with. I think it's worth also maybe talking about a few other examples where maybe you can kind of see what I was saying about the kind of systemic aspect of these issues. We represented, I think, about 11 clients back in October, again on a flight, and they all had really horrific stories, experiences of having come and escaped Eritrea, and there was forced military service, and really harrowing tales of what they went through in Libya and their journey eventually to the UK. And again, it was clear from, just one initial chat with them that they were potential victims of trafficking, and there was a clear trafficking route via Libya for most of them. And in the end, we got them all off the flight. And I think it's examples like that show, it's not just a coincidence that this one bad thing happened one time, but if you've got 11 clients who all have their own horrific experiences and what they went through, and that's not being either it's not being, the Home Office aren't asking the questions, or they're not really taking the time to do that, and they don't care to. But there's something that's going wrong there, because really they're meant to have some kind of protective way of identifying these victims and giving them support. But we've seen consistently that that's just not really happening. And I mean, that was just 11 clients that we were able to get referrals to and contact and get access to call them and speak with them. So, and again, that was just one flight. So we don't know how often, again, that happens, where the actual, the background isn't really being looked at properly. And we don't know how many are being returned to countries where they genuinely fear, again, being tortured or being imprisoned or worse, and how often the Home Office isn't really taking into account their backstory and any evidence that's been kind of put to them. So I think as an example, it's worth just saying that happens, and it consistently happens. which is a real shame. But again, what we're up against. So we kind of need to really be aware that as kind of the opponent in some of these issues, it's more than just the incompetence, like I was saying, I think. And it does make you want to fight more and get you more passionate, but it can also, be difficult and a bit of disillusioning sometimes when you feel that you're up against something that's just consistently failing these people.
And just an example with these where was this charter flight going to, did you say?
So this one, they were all from Eritrea.
They were from Eritrea.
But it's under what's called the Dublin regulations, so where they are deemed to be able to return back to a safe country, which is a country they went to beforehand. So, for example, Switzerland.
Okay. And where were these people being held up until the flight?
So they're typically held in detention centres. So often they all come to the UK, and what happens is they go to a police station, they claim asylum, and then they're given a kind of a weekly support and some accommodation. And then at some point, when the Home Office has seen and looked at their case and they've determined that they're either asylum claim is being refused, or like these ones, they're being returned to what's deemed a safe third country, they then detain them, and usually asylum seekers have to report. So they go to a centre on either a weekly or a fortnightly or monthly basis, depending on kind of their case. They'll go to just report, literally just a sign to say that they're there, and then they go home. But that's also the opportunity where they are detained. So then they're taken to a detention centre. And I think it's also maybe worth mentioning that some people that have served a time in prison, have been, have committed a crime and then sentenced, on the day or usually around the time that they're meant to be released, they can also be held under immigration powers in prison. So actually they often don't know until, right at the last minute that they are going to continue to be detained. And then they remain in prison until obviously the Home Office thinks, okay, this is when they can be removed and this is when this flight is scheduled for. So, and that's kind of going back to the issue around the deportation and the Jamaica charter flight, is this concept of double punishment, and that you've served your time, and regardless of what you feel about prison and the prison system, which is for a different day, but you've done that and you should be released. But because of the laws in the UK and the way that they are, if you have committed a crime 12 months or more, that sentence is 12 months or more, then that kind of triggers this automatic deportation. So, and you don't necessarily know that, especially if you've been living in the UK for decades, say, and you've committed a crime and you had no idea, or you didn't realise that you should have applied for citizenship. Again, the case of the twins who face deportation to different countries, I mean, there's so much in that, but part of their issue was that they were under the care of social services, and I think that they didn't apply for citizenship at the time. So when they committed the crime, they weren't deemed a British citizen, and therefore they were subject to these laws. So, and 12 months is really, it's not a lot. I mean, a lot of people therefore can then just be subject to this automatic deportation. But that's the double punishment, is then you're faced with, I've served my time, I've been to prison, and now I have to face being removed to a country that I barely know, and to lose, my family, my network here, the support, all of that. And so we see a lot of that as well, and that concept of double punishment is obviously again really problematic, and there is the institutional kind of the racism within that, the language around them being serious criminals, and no consideration as to them maybe having a family here in the UK, and being fathers or mothers or whatever it might be. So there's a lot in that, and I think maybe some people don't realise that you can be held in prison, and that can also happen. But it's definitely, it definitely happens, and it's been happening.
And when you get successfully get people off a flight, sorry if this is a really silly question, but where do they go then?
No, it's not a silly question. It depends really on where, on what their circumstances are before. So they might be taken off the flight, and the Home Office might think that they should stay in detention because they will try and remove them in a short time frame again. So and you can apply for bail, so apply to get the client released, and the Home Office can also oppose that and say, no, we're going to remove them in a reasonable time frame. And this was happening actually during coronavirus and pandemic. There were a lot of bail applications, and the Home Office kind of was refusing to change their mind, and they were standing their ground that they could remove all of these people within a reasonable time frame, despite the fact that we're in a global pandemic. And really, especially 2 months ago, I mean, borders were all effectively closed, and there's no two ways about that. But so you can apply for bail and be given a Home Office accommodation, or you can go back to where you were living before. Often the Home Office uses the fact that a client doesn't have accommodation to go to on release to keep them in detention, to say, well, they're a criminal, we need to approve this address, and there is no appropriate address for them. So the best thing for them is just to stay in detention. And obviously, again, that isn't that's not lawful, and there's no way that they can argue that that should be the case, that they stay in detention, even just for the fact that there's no accommodation for them. But that's the kind of arguments that can be made by the Home Office, and that's again what we tend to challenge when it comes to accommodation issues.
That's very depressing.
Yeah.
Very depressing. Thank you for that. Sorry, continue.
That's okay. Yeah, so I don't know, maybe if it would be good to talk a bit about some of the charities that we work with, and just give some names out. So a little shout out to them for anyone that might be interested to, do some background research, do a bit of homework, or volunteer, or whatever you might want to do. A lot of the charities that we work with are obviously a lot smaller, and they're pretty incredible. I mentioned talking about getting clients released on bail. Bail for immigration detainees has been working pretty tirelessly throughout this pandemic. I think it's almost all of the applications they've made have been granted, and they've been able to get everyone out. But again, it's worth saying that they've had to make those applications, and the Home Office has opposed the reasons for bail in every kind of circumstance. But they do amazing work, and as do Detention Action. So that was actually the NGO that we represented in February for the charter flight related that challenge was them, and they support people in detention centres often, pretty much, and also London-based prisons, I think. But some of the work that they do, for example, was gathering with our challenge. They were gathering witness statements. They were contacting detainees and trying to make sure that they had access to solicitors, and helping make referrals out to law firms like us. So the referral I got, the client that came to the UK aged 4, he was a referral that we received from Detention Action, because they were obviously concerned that he had no representation. He had representation, but they were private paying, and they basically gave up on his case, and they said, there's not much we can do at this point because you're on this charter flight. And so that's when it came to us 48 hours before the flight, and we helped him. And other ones, so the Helen Bamber Foundation and Freedom from Torture work with asylum seekers and refugees who have experienced torture, or are victims of like trafficking, torture, and that kind of thing from their home country. Again, referrals, we receive referrals, and they do offer, again, also help and support. So usually medical assistance, if we need, for example, expert reports, we can get them from organisations like the Helen Bamber Foundation. And then also maybe a slightly more niche, Women for Refugee Women is also amazing, and specifically on women who are victims of human trafficking or otherwise, and kind of working with them to campaign for for policies that don't negatively impact on them, and for those women that are coming into the UK that maybe don't have access to that kind of support, making sure that there are ways that they can access that support as well. And I think one of the other referrals I received was from one of the clients, was a referral from them, and this client, as an example, I mean, she had suffered a lot in in Albania, in her home country, and she came to the UK. She had paid privately, thinking that she wasn't eligible, kind of lost all of that money on solicitors that completely made an very outdated and pointless application, basically. And then also in her initial refusal letter, so I think we talked about this before a bit, when it comes to incompetence, if you're thinking, put yourself in the minds of an asylum seeker, the decision letter from the Home Office is literally the most important piece of paper that you'll receive. So that usually can also come with a lot of delays. So we've had clients that have waited 3-4 years for a decision, which obviously adds to their mental health, their anxieties. They're waiting all that time. Their status is uncertain. They don't know if tomorrow is going to be the day that they receive a refusal. And this client, so she was from Albania, and in her refusal letter, there was a line that said something like, "There's no reason why you can't safely return or relocate in Pakistan." And it was just completely, I mean, it's laughable because it's so wrong, but then you speak to other colleagues, or I've seen on Twitter as well, people talk about it. This happens across the board. So often it's obviously just a copy paste exercise that's gone wrong, and they just haven't proofread the letter. And you think, if they're not proofreading that letter, then what else are they failing to look at? What else are they not doing or scrutinizing, which is their job and which is what they're supposed to do? But I think it's worth bearing in mind these kind of specific examples when we talk about the institutional racism, or the systemic aspects of the Home Office and their policies, because there are so many clients, there are so many people that are directly affected by these policies on a daily basis. And it can be something as simple as not having looked at the evidence and then making a refusal, which impacts on that person's life, and then they're going to be removed to somewhere where they genuinely will face torture or otherwise back in that home country. So they're minor things, but they have a huge impact on that client. And we're talking, each individual, thousands and thousands of people are in similar circumstances every day. And that is kind of, again, what we're up against is that level of not just incompetence, but quite cruel in the way that they consistently fail to look at people's circumstances and their case properly.
This blows my mind as well, because it goes so much beyond the physical a feeling of uncertainty and being unsafe, but it's also just reading on paper that someone just doesn't care about you enough to even look into your documents properly, or to proofread the letter that's going to change your life the most properly. And I think, and I know you mentioned that when we had our initial call, is that it's such a mental and emotional battle constantly of just not feeling like you matter, or that this country and those who represent this country care about you.
Yeah. I mean, often you're speaking with people that, again, have been let down in the past, that have left literally everything to come here, and then to be treated like they're not even human. And I've had a number of clients kind of say, like, this is no life. This is just not. This isn't kind of. I'm not being treated with respect, and there's no respect because of their status, or because of the fact that they're black, or because they can't speak the language. And often, again, a lot of these people can't speak the language, so they don't even have that, and that's quite disempowering. I think it can feel really. You can feel really vulnerable when you don't have a grasp of the language, and you can't respond back or understand what's being said. And there are also we see circumstances and instances where they say that they said this in an interview and the interpreter got it wrong, but they weren't aware of what they interpreted back to the interviewer. So and that, again, is quite, you feel like a loss of agency as someone who's gone through all of this, and then they're telling their story, and some of it is being misinterpreted or being explained in a way that isn't true, and you're not necessarily aware of that until later down the line when we see the transcript, or we see, oh, this is what was said, did you actually say that? And they say, there's no way I meant that. That's so I think there's failings on every level. And not to, obviously this sounds really depressing, but there is so much as well in when you do finally get the good news. I mean, there's literally no better feeling than that. It doesn't come that often, obviously, because things take time. There are always delays. Things always, take longer than you expect and hope. But yeah, you're really helping people that are the most marginalized and don't really often have anywhere else to go, and don't know what to do either. They have no idea what the law is in the UK, or how to apply for things, or what evidence they need for certain cases. And all of that takes time to explain and get them, again, to kind of be a bit trusting of you, especially if they've been through other solicitors who've messed them up. So it's obviously rewarding. It's just long-term rewards. You don't really see any short-term wins, unless it's like urgent work and stuff like that. But otherwise, it's it's very, very long term. But that's, as you said, I sleep better at night knowing I'm doing that than something that's not fulfilling, or something else, even if it's paid well, which obviously is a big plus for many people. But it's and I was paid very well during my time at Amnesty, but kind of jumped down to this, which is, again, I think a testament to, like, if you care about something, then it's worth taking the time to relearn and change careers and do all of that.
Yeah. How often do you not sleep well at night? Because I have this with many occupations. I just think I could never do that, because I would take it home with me every day, every night. I wouldn't sleep because, you're dealing with humans that maybe, you feel for, and there's so much empathy and sympathy, and maybe a recognizable story or a recognizable face. How do you deal with that?
Good question. I think it's tricky. I think, again, not to go on about my team, because clearly I love them very much and I'm very fond and miss them loads in this pandemic. But I think being able to run to other people and being able to just kind of have a little offloading and making sure that you've got time to talk about things with people that understand and know what it is. But also, I think switching off is really important, and just taking the time to, I'm a hypocrite because I've got my emails on my phone, but I would say not having emails on your phone is a really good example of switching off. And, ways that you can just at least take some time out of the day to, like, draw a line and say, right, this is it, it's over. But it's really easier said than done, especially when you have clients that contact you on WhatsApp, or that, there's no concept of a weekend when they're anxious and they're scared about what's going on or what's going to happen to them. There's, and that you kind of also have to be relative to that and think, this is okay, I can do half an hour here and just make sure I draw a line under it. But you have to appreciate also they don't have that weekend because they're anxious all the time and they don't know what's going on. But again, I guess not beating yourself up for not responding straight away either. I think you need to take some time to recharge, to actually be good at your job and to be able to help them as effectively as possible. You can't really do it 24/7 if you're not looking after yourself. So I think that's, it's important. Good question.
Brilliant. Do you have anything else for us? I didn't take notes this time from our call, so I actually don't know what you're running through exactly, but I know you've given the examples and the charities.
I think the one thing I did want to mention was the book.
Yes.
So I think for anyone that
Britain, I've remembered.
Yeah. So I think for anyone that is interested in this kind of stuff, and maybe also wants to appreciate the wider point, so not boring legal jargon book of the law, but actually understanding the wider colonial context and the historical background to the immigration laws of today, and why it's important to care about those things, especially in light of all the language around the statues, and how people are saying that Britain is obsessed with its colonial past in a very unhealthy, actually, racist way. The book is called Bordering Britain, and it's written by Nadine El-Anani. And I think if you just type in Bordering Britain, Nadine, it'll come up. But it came out early this year, so it's pretty new, and it's quite nice, and it feels quite fresh as well. I've just started reading it, but I feel like for anyone that's interested in immigration law, but also not just from a neutral standpoint of the law and understanding just the law, but the context within which these current laws are actually in place. I would recommend highly, Bordering Britain by Nadine.
I've already ordered mine yesterday after our
Great.
call, so I can let everyone know
That's great.
how easy it is to read. Where can we find you and kind of stay up to date? If anyone has any questions about what you do or what they could look into, or maybe even some of the charities that you mentioned earlier, where can we find you? How can we stay in touch?
Yes, I'd be more than happy to chat to anyone that wanted to chat after this. My Twitter and Instagram are the same, so it's just Dunya Kamal _. And I can, I'll be chatting about this, so hopefully people can find me. But it's just my name, Dunya Kamal _, and it's the same on both platforms. And my DMs are open, so I'm happy to chat at any time about this kind of stuff.
And that's Dunya, Dunya.
Sorry, yes, yeah. Sometimes I get it wrong and people think it's June or Julia that I've said about my own name. So thanks for spelling it out.
Because there's also Dunya with Dounia.
That's correct. Yeah, no, it's DUNYAKAMAL.
I want to thank you so much for today's session. I hope everyone who joined us live thought this was very informative and helpful. Tell your friends and family to listen to the audio recording tomorrow on Rinse 4 to 5. Obviously, if you're hearing this on radio now, then we're already done. I want to thank you so much. That was really helpful. And I think, it's such a current topic and we keep seeing it more and more on the news, but none of us really understand how these things can happen. And also just to hear that it's the government doing it when they should be the ones protecting, then it becomes a very intricate conversation.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for us to be aware of people like yourself and the firm that you work for, that they exist, how you work with other charities, and these are charities that we can look into. Thank you so much. People are saying so interesting and eye-opening. Great talk. Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Again, the video will be up on YouTube next week. Audio, once it has aired live on Rinse, it will go up on podcast, on Rinse FM, SoundCloud, and on mine as well. So you can listen back to it anytime you like. And we will be back with another session next Monday, 8 p.m. Dunya, thank you so much. And thank everyone for tuning in.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Yeah.